All right, thank you for the introduction. A few people have already talked about uneven terrain today, but just to kind of drive the point home, we walk on uneven surfaces all the time. We walk on grass, gravel, and uneven sidewalks. But the majority of motion research is conducted on level surfaces, such as treadmills or in level gait labs. So the question is, what are we missing? What are we missing by only studying locomotion on these surface gates? And what we expect is for uneven terrain to lead to an increase in energy expenditure. And we expect that for several reasons, one of them being for changes in step parameters. So people would walk with wider steps for stability or change other things. Another reason that could, or another thing that could contribute to an increase in energy expenditure is joint work redistribution. It depends, I guess, if we ask. Some people would say that, you could expect a decrease in the positive work that the ankle does, and then the knee and the hip would compensate for that. And in previous studies, we've also talked about joint efficiency. So the hip and the knee are not as efficient joints. So if they're overcompensating for the ankle, then probably causes an increase in energy expenditure. There are, of course, other factors, such as muscle coactivation, changes in step frequencies, and others. But I'm not going to talk about this today. I'm only going to talk about the first two that I mentioned. So in order to study the effects of uneven terrain on the dynamics in a laboratory setting, we constructed an uneven terrain treadmill. And basically just blocks of 3 different heights that are put on the treadmill. They're pretty thin, so that way they can curve around the treadmill. We've modified the treadmill so they can curve around. And you can see they're made out of wood with a thin layer of foam covering the top for comfort purposes. Our subjects walked in socks. And what we were interested in was in measuring, obviously, the difference between the bare surface, which is just the level treadmill belt, and the uneven terrain. But since our uneven terrain is covered in this foam surface, we wanted to make sure that the foam didn't change the heat dynamics, so we added a third condition called the even foam. What we noticed is actually that there's no statistical difference between the level foam and just level treadmill belt. And so I'm actually not going to talk about the bare condition, and I'm going to refer to the foam condition as the control. So I'm only going to talk about 2 conditions. Our subjects walked for 10 minutes on each condition, and we collected their metabolic data and their kinematic data during these trials. The terrain itself was actually removable, so we could take it off the treadmill and put it on top of in-ground force plates and collect ground reaction forces in a separate data collection. And what we saw was that there is an increase in metabolic cost. There's actually on this terrain, which is about 1.5 inches of perturbations, there's about a 30% increase in metabolic cost. The question, once again, is what causes this? So the first thing we looked at was the step parameters. And this is how I'm going to present them. I have step length plotted against step width, which were calculated as the x and y directions from the calcaneus markers of the 2 feet. And first, looking at the variability, just to make sure we are in fact perturbing them like we wanted to. This is a representative subject. The black dots are individual steps for that subject on the control condition on the level foam, and the blue dots are on the uneven terrain. The ellipses are covariance ellipses, so they tell you how spread the dots are. And so what we see is that the step width variability increases by about 30%, the step length variability increases by about 50%. So we are perturbing them in those 2 directions. Of course, it's also interesting to see if we're perturbing them in the vertical direction. So looking at a different angle of those dots are in a 3 dimensions. So here we have step length and step height. And we see that the blue dots are more spread over, so in fact, the variability in the height direction almost double, which is not so.
What's step height?
I'm sorry?
What is step height?
Step height is from level ground this way, so from the calcaneus marker, so at heel strike. Does that make sense?
We just start with that because of the ground. It's not about that. That's about the ground, not about the person.
Yes. But I'm just trying to get the point across that we are in fact perturbing them. This is uneven terrain by our definition. But looking at the means of these parameters, and here's where the means of the step height probably doesn't really make sense, but looking at the step length and the step width decreased a little bit, but the step length got wider by about 30%. And 30%, what does that mean in terms of metabolic cost? Is that a lot? Is that too little? Sounds like a lot. But if we look at previous data, published by Daley and Crow in 2001. So they did a study where they varied step length and measured the metabolic cost. And the graphs here, the step widths, I'm sorry, I think I misspoke. They varied step widths and measured the metabolic cost. And the step widths here are presented in terms of leg length, so the normalized to leg length. And if we plot the data, so fit the terrain data into this curve, it looks like this. So the gray dot is the level ground. It's going to be, the most efficient, the bowl of that curve. And then the blue dot is 30% over of it's 30% larger step width. And they're really close. You can zoom in a lot and see a difference, but it's only about a 0.5% of an increase in cost of transport. So maybe step width doesn't cause quite as big of an energetic difference as we thought. So then, the next thing we looked at was joint work per stride, and here's the positive work. The knee and the hip did significantly more positive work, whereas the ankle didn't really quite change as much. And in fact, we see a total of a 28% increase in total positive work. And similarly, the knee does more negative work, and there's more negative work on uneven terrain. Now, once again, it's the percentages, so we're talking about percentages, but how do we compare percentages to percentages? So one way to look at it is to look at the marginal differences and to plot the net metabolic rate on the x-axis along against the average positive joint power, which was just average positive joint work times the step frequency. And so they're not.
The joint works, are those in the sagittal plane only, or are they in out of plane?
No, they're in the sagittal plane only.
Just sagittal.
So we see our 2 points, and the relationship between them, that line that sloped. Here are just the numbers. Those are the differences between the two axes. And the relationship between them is the delta efficiency is kind of, the marginal change of one condition with the other, of how one condition affects the other. So we see a delta efficiency of about 30%. We know that muscle efficiency is about 25%, which is pretty close to 30%. And what this suggests is that maybe these changes in metabolic cost can be explained by muscle work. So it can be explained by muscle work, and maybe not so much everything else. But that's still to be looked into. So in summary, we showed that uneven terrain does cause about a 30% increase in metabolic cost on our terrain. We did see step parameter changes. We saw wider steps, 30% increase, but maybe they're not as significant. Maybe they're not that important and contributing to the increase in metabolic cost. And we did see a change in joint work, so maybe not so much a redistribution because there was actually more work done. It was just a change in joint work. The hip and knee did more positive work, and the knee did more negative work. And of course, there are other factors that could contribute, but that's for later presentations. And so that's the summary, and since all the cool people in Michigan have limericks, this is a summary in poem form. When you're walking on uneven ground, it takes more energy to get round. A lab test on rough treads alters placement of legs, and work shifting toward hips can be found.
So when you put your foot on the ground on rough terrain, your foot is twisted a bit, which might be harder to keep upright. So I'm wondering if which might show up in the joint works as well. So one of the ways you might check that is to put people in stiff-soled shoes where they can't comply as much. That might get something interesting.
Sure. That wasn't a question, right? That was a statement.
Do you think that's a good idea?
Do I think that's a good idea? I think there are so many things that we can test with this particular treadmill or this setup that you're never going to get the perfect representation. We're not claiming that this is a perfect representation of the uneven ground that we walk on all the time. So there's going to be error. If it was up to me, I would probably change other things first and maybe then go to that. What would I change? Well, the pattern of the treadmill. So right now we have three different heights, and they're offset. But they're set up in 3 columns, right? And so technically there is a seam that lines that runs along the treadmill belt. I think depending on the person, sometimes people automatically walk with wider steps. They just walk on the outside, and they don't get perturbed side to side as much. So I would probably offset those columns first.
Oh. Well, since I have the microphone, I'll.
Who's talking? I can't see. Oh.
We saw how important ankle stiffness is in walking, and I'm wondering if you looked at the plane of the foot. So if you land and your foot is at a different angle, well, that seems like it'll affect the dynamics because you're now at a different operating region of the ankle tendons.
Right. So actually can skip. So this is the raw data. So you can see that ankle angle that would kind of be related to what you're asking about, right? And so there are some changes. We also measured muscle activation, EMG, and so another thing to look into is like the co-activation of the ankle. So that could give some insight of whether or not it's stiffening up. I don't know if I'm really answering your question.
Yeah, did you measure ankle angles during the gait?
Yes.
And did the foot deform a lot since you're walking in socks? I'm wondering how you approximate the ankle.
How I approximate?
How you measured it, to what point
Using Visual 3D software, we have markers on the foot and then on the shank, and then it's two segments, and it's the angle between that. So there is error, right, because people are walking in socks. Sorry, okay.
So, when you showed the variability data of your step widths and step lengths, you had little ellipsoids that sort of showed general distribution. And in the normal case, they're distributed along the medial lateral axis, and then in the uneven terrain, it sort of shifted so that it was at an angle.
Right.
Does that mean anything? Does that mean that there's some coupling going on between forward placement and side placement that is not there?
Yeah. To be honest with you, I don't have a good answer for you. I've looked into it. I think so, but I won't be able to really explain it. Sorry.
Since I have the microphone, I'll selfishly ask a question. Did you look into any artifacts due to possible synchronization between the step and the shape function of the treadmill?
No, I did not. No, I did not.
I'm guessing it would vary from trial to trial. But
Yeah, as I mentioned, what I'm worried about most is people walking with wider steps and walking on the outside two columns. But I'm not too concerned about them sinking in the fore-aft directions because the blocks themselves are only about 6 inches long. So most people have feet that are wider than that, so they're bound to be perturbed with every step. And you can't really get accustomed to that.
I've got a microphone back here, so I'll bet in. Back here on the other side. So it looked like from the video that the subject was high stepping, and that would probably make sense if you're trying not to stub your toe and trip. So what about what's going on in swing phase? It seems like you're focusing on stance.
I am mostly focusing on stance, and the video, I was wondering if I would get a question about the video. So the video is actually, the subject wasn't very typical, so his gait does look a little weird when compared to all my other subjects. So I haven't looked at the videos, but I know it looks strange, but really it's not as strange looking.
Can you answer the question? What about swing versus stance cost?
I haven't, I don't have the graphs here. I don't know, I haven't looked at it.
Does this work? You had a couple of hypotheses about what contributes to the work, the cost increase. What about just sort of a simpler version of your work calculations involving the fact that they're going up and down, essentially the positive work and negative work at the leg level required to go up and down sort of in the uneven terrain. And another issue is you're using the steady state metabolic cost curve as a function of step width, but presumably step width and step lengths are changing all the time. How reasonable is it to use a steady state sort of metabolic cost curve to use for something that's transient essentially all the time?
That's a good question. I don't know of any other way to approximate metabolic cost if this gait is constantly changing. People do eventually kind of get used to it and adapt, so you can actually hold conversations. At first they're all like, don't talk to me, I just want to focus on walking. And so they do get used to it and become more comfortable, and that's, I think, the best you can do in terms of steady state on uneven terrain. I don't know how to really address that.
You have to stop here.